hating somebody or judging someone based on external, if you like, characteristics or religion, that's prejudice, and everybody's capable of that. Racism, and this is why I think when we keep talking about people being racist, I think it's often incorrect, is racism is a construct, and it's a construct rooted in power. So we're going to talk about, I shouldn't say my favourite subject because that doesn't feel right to say my favourite subject, but we're going to talk about racial justice. Let's start by saying, how would you define racism?
So here we go.
Yeah, put your glasses on.
Put the glasses on so I can actually see what I wrote. So I want to read the Oxford Dictionary, how they define it.
Right.
So they define racism as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior.
Right.
Now, I've heard many, many definitions of racism which centre in and around that sort of thought. So here is my challenge to some of these concepts about racism. So to buy into any of these definitions and any variants of this definition is to buy into the argument that there are different races. And I believe that contravenes God's own word and God's law. Because in his word and his law, he made one race with different ethnos due to location, due to where we live, and making sure that we can be acclimatized to whatever our circumstances, living conditions that's changed over the years, as we know. So if we go back to John Rawls' A Theory of Justice and some of his definitions. So he basically asserts that justice is the first virtue of social institutions as truth is of systems of thought. A theory, however elegant and economical, must be rejected or revised if it is untrue. Likewise, laws and institutions, no matter how efficient or seemingly well arranged, must be reformed or abolished if they are unjust. And I link that back to the whole premise of racism and the definitions of racism.
Okay.
Because if we have a definition that speaks of different races and people having racism, and we link that to John Rawls' assertion of truth, then if it's untrue and it's contrary to God's word, then it needs to be rejected or reformed, abolished or changed.
Yes.
So for me, I come back to, yes, in theory and in essence, it is the assertion, it is the control, it is the power, it is the treatment or using your position to oppress, to control, to be discriminatory to people who are of different backgrounds and different colours to you. And in order to address some of these things, I think we have to go back to the original mindset and start to reconcile that we are not different races. We are one race, we are humans. And then if I bring all the other people back into the humanization conversation, then we can start from how do we reconcile, how do we heal, how do we treat each other back to God's own, as in God's own image. So it's a slightly complicated in answering what is racism and how we reconcile it.
Okay. Go back to the Oxford Dictionary. Can you reread it? And then I'm going to counter it because I don't think that's what racism is either. But read what the Oxford Dictionary is.
So they say that it defines racism as prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior.
Okay. So I would argue that there is a difference between racism and prejudice. I think all human beings have the capacity to prejudge in a negative way another group of people. It doesn't matter if you're black, if you're Asian, between different groups. We know that, blacks, black Africans and black Caribbeans are prejudiced towards each other at times. So we know that hating somebody or judging someone based on external, if you like, characteristics or religion, that's prejudice, and everybody's capable of that. Racism, and this is why I think when we keep talking about people being racist, I think it's often incorrect, is racism is a construct, and it's a construct rooted in power.
Exactly.
And so I dug this book out because it's a great book, Staying Power by Peter Fryer. It was from my mum's wardrobe library. And he's a Yorkshireman, but he really sort of breaks this down I think in a simple way.
Yeah.
When prejudice existed before the slave trade, we know, for example, that there were Britain's black Africans in this country in the 1500s. We know that people had prejudgments about certain groups of people long before the slave trade existed. But when, and I just want to read this because it really is, he does it so well. So he says, he's talking about the slave trade and how Britain became the leading slave trading nation in the world. And it said, it was their drive, speaking of the English, for profit that led English merchant capitalists to traffic in Africans. There was big money in it.
Yeah.
The theory, i.e. the racist theory, came later to underpin this way of gaining capital through treating Africans as property, as slave labor, was about money and it was about power. To underpin it, it was underpinned by the theory of racism that black people were inferior to, which I guess is a bit of the Oxford Dictionary definition, this idea that whites were superior to blacks. So my assertion is that when we talk about reverse racism, there isn't such a thing. I don't think blacks can be racist towards whites. I think black people can be prejudiced and hate white people. I think that's a factual. We know that that's factually accurate. To say they're racist, we're using this definition of structure, a construct to assert power through racial lines, I don't think it's true. You mentioned about this idea of different races. There isn't such a thing as different races. There is one race, and there are different ethnicities. There are different ethnicities between Africans, between Southeast Asians, between Asians, between supposedly white people. There are different ethnicities, but I think it's really important to understand the difference because then people can start taking ownership of certain things.
For sure. So building on what you said, I agree with that totally. And going back even further, it's going back to how did racial constructs start in the very first place? And if you go back all the way to the 16th century, people like Linnaeus, people like Benir, like they started to create people groups in classification based on colour, but their original intents, and I think this is what people need to look at, like particularly the early people that started some of this classification, predominantly did it based on the four globes of the world and predominantly did it for descriptive purposes. It was not for control and power, because at that time and 15th century, there were, prior to people's popular knowledge, there were many people, particularly from Ethiopia, particularly from other African countries, who were seen as scholars, equals. The Martin Lutherian movement, and Martin Luther himself speaks to taking counsel from lots of different people of colour, and understanding how the Ethiopian church worked, understanding how leading scholars and writing and including their narratives and their research into his own development of his thoughts and his philosophies and things like that. And there's so much evidence that sort of like these classifications, people of colour were treated, most of the issues were class issues more so than people being discriminated against because of their colour. And there are people that, of colour that have been in Europe and Britain and all of these things for centuries, decades, of prominence, of great wealth, of great stature. So you have to start to think about how, when classification of people groups came about, then what happened to get to the point of using those classifications now to bring in greed, control, make commodities, make money, doing all of those things that we see in like the pre-transatlantic slave movement, but equally in modern day slavery that we still see eminent now, by continuing to keep people classified in these groups.
Absolutely.
You continue to be able to use racial structures and these kind of constructs that was man-made and was never God-made to continue to oppress, to continue to dehumanize. And it was literally by dehumanizing. So if you do, the theory of otherness, if you buy into the concept of different races, you buy into the concept that the race that is dominant and predominant at that time, i.e. what we're living in now. So you would have the people who classify it as the white race in positions of power can other and dehumanize and belittle every other race by buying into that concept that we are different races. So I feel like it's until we get the right premise and understand these constructs and understand where racial classifications came from, you can't even begin to start to break down the barriers of racism, the challenges of racism, because the reason we continue to have it in all of these, decades later, and no matter reform, no matter the Emancipation Proclamation and all of these things have not been able to kill and destroy the not only the prevalence of racism, but the constructs that sit behind it. And that's because it goes back to that point of the thought of truth has to be at the center of any theory that's developed. So if you start from a flawed premise, every outcome you get thereafter is flawed. So we're still at this place because we have not addressed the classification of people groups and then the use of that classification for evil things.
Yeah, that's so good. It's so funny. I remember going to this church once and this Ugandan lady came up to pray, and I'll never forget it because she was praying and she said, God, you never talked about the first world and the third world. You just said the world, and we have bought into constructs and ideas that are entirely worldly. They are not from God at all, and we have sort of used the Bible to underpin ideologies that are man-made to have power over other people. But the beauty of constructs is they can be dismantled.
Exactly. Exactly.
And as you said, that idea of once we understand the root cause of things, we can start to dismantle them.
And I just wanted to add, so my goddaughter, and we was having this conversation a couple of days ago about prejudice and racism, and she said, everybody prejudges.
Absolutely.
Right? We all prejudge. And we can all have, as you said, that capacity to prejudge. Who introduced in the very first place the concept that people of colour were savages? That people of colour were non-human, that people of colour don't feel pain to the same way and therefore can be experimented on? Who brought into that ideology, into books, into society, the idea that they are to be feared, they are to be powerful? Where did these prejudgments come from? Because none of those judgments are based on, truth, fact, or anything like that. And she was saying that from people of colour's perspectives, their prejudgments and sometimes their fears are based on what was actually done to them. And the history of what's been done.
Actual lived experience.
The actual lived experience, the horrors of what have been done. So until there's an understanding from the side that's in power and on the side of the oppressor, there is a responsibility that comes, if you're talking about reconciliation, in there having a sensitivity and an understanding and almost not just empathy, but real acknowledgement that those who are coming from an oppressed background have a legitimacy to some of their prejudgments.
Okay, interesting.
When I've worked with people who have been victims of molestation or people who've been victims of domestic violence or any of those things, the allies, if you want for a better of a word, allyship, so the predominantly males and things like that, understand and have a full acknowledgement and acceptance and happiness to be even more sensitive in their approach, in their handling, in their support, because they know predominantly victims of those victims of domestic violence who has where it's been at the hands of a man will have some prejudgments
about men.
So they approach it very sensitively and very carefully. And in my mind, it's that same sort of approach, rather than what we see with a denial and a defense, and that's not in my history, and I'm not this, and I'm not that, and I'm not the other. There needs to be a fundamental shift in mindset, because the prejudgments that on this side were not justified. What they have not done, there's not a history, do you see what I mean, of people of non-colour doing certain things that have justified why the people in power and oppression and have the views that they have. But there is a legitimacy the other side.
Interesting. Okay, so let's talk about mindsets. Let's talk about the fact that, and I have this conversation with people all the time, most people would say, I am not racist. Yeah. That's what most people say.
Yeah.
And I would say, for example, the white people I'm around, they're not racist people. And so, and I think it's such a, nobody wants to be called that.
Yeah.
Nobody wants to be called that.
Yeah.
So how do you address something with people that either aren't racist or do not feel that they're racist?
Yeah.
They don't have slave-holding ancestors, for example. How do you address what you've just said to people that are like, I am not racist, and they don't want it, it's like, it becomes like, la, 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 they just don't want to hear it anymore because of that. So how do you address that?
So I think that moves me to the second part of the definition of racism. So I probably have a wider definition in my own mind around those who directly oppress and those who benefit from the privilege of being part of the group of the oppressors, even if you are not one yourself.
Okay.
A couple of things really that come to mind is when Martin Luther King basically was like, you know, if you are silent, you are complicit.
Yeah.
And your silence can be taken as agreement.
Right.
If you benefit from all of the privileges of an unjust, oppressed system that oppresses one group over another, and you do not, particularly if you're Christian, and you do nothing to speak up for it, all of those things are contravening to God's law, to moral law, to being a good neighbour, to all of those things. So when people say that they are not racist, but are not moved by compassion for those who suffer at the hand of racism, then I start to question your mindset. I start to question how much do you understand about what your Christian, biblical, and just human duty is. So that's one side of it that I would explore with them. And then the other side is, okay, you say that you don't have a history, you know, in your own personal family of slave ancestors. However, I would question many first and foremost to really look into that, because fundamentally, you know, predominantly wealthy Europeans, particularly in Britain, will find somewhere in their history there is a link to the slave trade. And if there's not a direct link, there will be indirect links. And I guess, so for me, it's around that first and fundamental, not so much shifting the mind, but shifting your heart first and foremost.
Okay.
Because I feel that your mindset will change when your heart changes. When you see me and have compassion, and when you see me in the image of God, when you see me through the eyes of God, you should be moved by compassion and compelled to not be complicit with a system that is racist. And then the third area is, I almost want to take the kind of racism and the terminology and the language and take it out and do something different with it, because I think it's such a barrier and a hindrance to open conversation. I think there's the third area is have an honest, open conversation with yourself and with others and create a safe space. The people I've spoken to who say to me, you know, I'm not racist, and, you know, I haven't got race bone in my body, and I don't see colour, all of these things. I don't see this, that, and the other. I understand their sentiment, where they're coming from. However, I've examined with some people. If we take the label off, do you have fears of tall black men? How do you feel? If you're the single person in a group, are you comfortable? If you see certain displays of behaviours from different people groups, different colours, different expressions, how different people groups dress, what are your thoughts and what are your fears? Let's have an honest and open conversation. Because some of those microaggressions, some of those subconscious behaviours and thoughts, have you really explored where they came from, and do they lend themselves to a racist narrative? And let's be honest and open about some of those things, because you may not think, you may lock racism down to, I do not call you a certain word, or I do not do this. But do you buy into some of the other things that have come from people who were racist and who were have developed these constructs to keep people oppressed. And then the other, I guess, expanding on that slightly is around, I've held many conversations that say, if you continue to have one side of the story, you cannot reconcile, you cannot even have an open mind or even having a conversation. If you continue to only hear the stories of people of colour, predominantly who've come through the slave traders, ancestors of the slave trade, we hear, let's talk discussions and let's talk race and let's do this and let's do that and let's do active listening and all of these kinds of things. And you continuously have people of colour in that position of now pouring out their stories to predominantly white people in positions of power. You're actually re-victimizing, and not just re-victimizing because of the trauma of having to tell it, but you're reinforcing the power difference and you being in a position of power and these group being in a position of oppressed and non-power, because it's tell me your story, let me be empathetic, let me listen, let me understand, let me learn. And I've often challenged those narratives and said, nobody has taught nobody teaches a black person how to treat and be decent to another black person, to a white person. Nobody taught you as a white person how to treat another white person decently. So you do not need to be taught how to treat me as a human, decently and things like that. And if we never explore the conversation around the oppressor, so I'm often saying, when you still have this one-sided narrative, you're always going to uphold the inequity and the inequality, because we never explore the mindset of the oppressor. So I've started to have those conversations with, some of my white colleagues and, in a safe and trusted, non-judgment, non-blame approach, so that they were able to start to explore, what does it feel like for those who have been racist or who've lend themselves to those tendencies? What got you there? What was your mindset? What was your story? And how can we start to level, the balance between hearing each other's sides and trying to and coming to reconciliation? And for those who say that they're not racist, but have benefited from the racial system, again, what stops you from speaking up? What stops you from, doing all of those things? What's your side? And what was your history? And how did it shape your worldview? And how did you get to this place? And then we can start to, explore further. So that's a whole lot of stuff there, but yeah.
But they're all good things. I don't want to speak for white people because I don't know.
Yeah.
But if you think you are benefiting from something, it's the same with women's liberation, right? Men thought they were fine with women just not doing anything. But the reality is you are also suffering if there's a whole bunch of people that aren't able to fulfill the fullness of who God has said they are.